Chapter 8, question number 1. This question deals with equivalent units for materials and conversion costs, and we're going to use the weighted average method. So if you recall from the chapter, equivalent units under the weighted average method is the number of units that were completed and transferred out of work in process plus the number of equivalent units still in work in process. So remember that equivalent units is calculated differently between the weighted average method and the FIFO method. So we have to pay attention to which method we're using so that we also know which method we're going to use to calculate equivalent units. So here it says Trevor Mills produces agricultural feed at its only plant. Materials are added at the beginning of the process. So if you see this phrase in any of our questions, that materials are added at the beginning of the process, that means that the moment we put a unit into process, all materials are 100% complete. Let's keep reading. Beginning inventory has 16,000 partially complete units. It says it's 10% complete with respect to conversion costs. That's going to be stuff like the labor and the overhead that's applied to the units. So in that case, it's only 10% complete. But we know that for materials, it's already 100% complete. These 16,000 units are 100% complete in terms of materials. We also know that we started 77,000 units in December. And again, these 77,000 units are 100% complete in terms of materials. It doesn't tell us where in the process it is with respect to conversion costs, though. Units transferred out were 73,000 units, so those must have been complete with respect to conversion costs. And then ending inventory is 20,000 units. And again, these 20,000 units already have 100% materials in them, but they're just 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. So we have to calculate the equivalent units for materials and for conversion costs. So again, we're looking at the number of units completed and transferred out, and also the number of equivalent units still in work in process. And we have to determine that based on materials and based on conversion costs. So the number of units transferred out is going to be 73,000, which is what the fact pattern tells us. When a unit is transferred out of work in process, it goes to completed goods. And if the goods are complete, that means that they are complete in terms of materials and also conversion costs. So for units transferred out, it's going to be the same number of units for materials and conversion costs. For equivalent units in ending inventory, in terms of materials, we know that materials is 100% complete. So for materials, we have another 20,000 equivalent units. Now for conversion costs, we're only 62% complete times 20,000 units. So 0.62 times 20,000 is 12,400. We add these two numbers up for each column, and so our answer is 93,000 for materials and 85,400 for conversion costs. So this is a little bit tricky because in prior chapters we had simple fact patterns where we didn't have any beginning inventory, and also we didn't have to differentiate between percentage of completion in terms of materials versus conversion costs, but now they're throwing an extra curveball at us in this chapter. Question number 2. This question has the same fact pattern, except now we're going to do the FIFO method. I actually like the FIFO method better because it makes more sense. For the weighted average method, remember that we are looking at the number of items completed and transferred out as our starting figure. But those items could have been created partially in the prior month, and then now they're completed in this month. And so when we give this month credit for those units, it might not be entirely fair because let's say the prior month had completed the units 99% of the way, and then now in this month we finish it off with the last 1%, and then now we're counting the equivalent units in this month. It's not really that clear of a picture. Or even in the prior example, some of the units were 100% done in terms of materials in the prior month, but we're counting them as completed in the current month because this is the month that the conversion costs were completed, and so the items are transferred out. So the weighted average method, like I said, doesn't always give a clear picture. I feel that the FIFO method gives a clearer picture. So when we use the FIFO method, we're going to look at three different figures. One is we're going to look at the equivalent units needed to complete the beginning inventory. Then we're going to look at the equivalent units of goods that were started and completed in the same month or period. And then we're going to look at the equivalent units of the goods remaining in ending inventory. And we're going to calculate equivalent units based on materials and also in respect to conversion costs. So for the first number to complete beginning inventory, for materials, remember that those 16,000 units were already 100% complete with respect to materials. So for this month, we don't have to add any more materials. Next, the goods started and completed in this period. There's a couple different ways to calculate this number, but one way is to look at the number of units transferred out. So there were 73,000 units transferred out, minus the 16,000 that was in beginning inventory, gives us 57,000 units. So let's go over that again. We transferred 73,000 units into finished goods. 16,000 of that came from beginning inventory because we're doing the FIFO method, the first in, first out. So out of those 73,000, 16 of them were the partially completed units in beginning inventory. So that means the other 57,000 must have come from the goods that were started and finished in this month. So we're going to do 57,000 units here in terms of materials. And then finally, we have our goods in ending inventory. We know that we have 20,000 units in ending inventory because that's what the fact pattern tells us. And again, we know that 100% of materials is put in the moment that the unit is started. So in terms of ending inventory, we have another 20,000 equivalent units with respect to materials. So our total is 77,000 units for materials. Again, beginning inventory is 0 because all the units from beginning inventory were already 100% complete with respect to materials. So we didn't have to put any materials in this month for beginning inventory. The 57,000 units that we started and completed, obviously we had to put in our materials in there. And then the goods in ending inventory, we know that any partial unit is already going to be 100% complete with respect to materials. So that's 57 plus 20 equals 77,000. Now we look at conversion costs. For conversion costs beginning inventory, the question tells us that these items were 10% complete with respect to conversion costs. So that means that we have to put in 90% in this month. It was 10% complete. We have to put in 90. So we do 0.9 times 16,000 units that were in beginning inventory. So we get 14,400 equivalent units with respect to conversion costs. For goods started and completed in this period, that'll be the same figure as materials. And then for goods in inventory, the fact pattern tells us that our goods are 62% complete with respect to conversion costs. So if we do 100% minus the 62% complete, we get 38% more that we need to add into the next month. And so to calculate what we did for this month, that's just the 62% times the 20,000 units. And we get 12,400 equivalent units that we did for this month. And so we sum up these three numbers and we get 83,800 for question number 2. Question number 3. This question is back to the weighted average method. But the curveball in this question is that it doesn't tell us how many units we completed and transferred out. It tells us the beginning inventory of 115,000 partially complete liters. It tells us the ending inventory of 85,000 liters, which were 25% complete with respect to materials and 60% complete with respect to conversion costs. And it tells us how many units we started this month, but it doesn't tell us how many were completed and transferred out into finished goods. So good thing we can calculate that on our own. So the book tells us that when we're counting the number of physical units, or the number of, in this case, cans of coloring, textile colorings, we're going to do beginning inventory plus the number of units started. And that gives us the total units to account for. We have 115,000 liters in beginning inventory plus 690,000 liters that we started this month. So now we know that we have 805,000 liters that we need to account for. We don't know at this moment how much of each liter has been filled, but we do know we have 805,000 paint cans, so to speak, in our factory, and we have to determine how full or empty each one of those liters is. So now that we know how many liters we have to account for, we can figure out how many we completed by doing 805,000 minus the 85,000 in ending inventory, and we get 720,000 completed liters. So now we need to figure out how many equivalent units we have in terms of materials and in terms of conversion cost. Remember, our first number is units transferred out, and so that's going to be the same for materials and conversion costs. We transferred out 720,000 liters that were complete. Next, the equivalent units in ending inventory. For materials, it tells us that materials are 25% complete. And it also tells us there are 85,000 liters in ending inventory. So that's 85,000 times 25%. I'm going to do 85,000 times 0.25. Get 21,250. And then for conversion costs, the fact pattern says that it's 60% complete. So that'll be 85,000 times 60%. That gives us 51,000. So to sum up the columns, materials, we have 741,250, and in terms of conversion costs, we have 771,000 liters. So that's question 3. Questions 4 through 7 are similar. It's either going to be doing the FIFO method or the weighted average method. So I'm going to let you guys do those on your own. Question 8. This question wants us to calculate the cost per unit transferred to finished goods inventory for each of the 3 binocular models in January. The fact pattern tells us that we have 3 models of binoculars: travel, sport, and pro. We have 2 different departments. The assembly department, which is where the components are purchased and assembled. It says that the travel and sport models are complete after the assembly process. The pro model has to go to another department called the calibration department to complete its assembly. Next, it says that the conversion costs are based on the number of units produced, and there are never any work in process inventories, so that's easy for us. We don't have to worry about equivalent units in this question. And then it gives us the number of units produced, the materials cost, and the conversion cost for assembly and calibration. So let's begin. We have the travel model, the sport model, and the pro model. The travel model, we have 10,000 units. The sport model, we have 7,500. And the pro model, we have 2,500. So let's see what our costs are going to be. The fact pattern gives us the material costs per model. 290,000 for travel, 847.5 for sport, and 462.5 for pro. For assembly, however, it just gives us totals. So we're going to have to calculate what each model should be allocated. So total assembly cost was 440,000. And so to calculate how much should be allocated to each model, that's just going to be the number of units. So for travel is 10,000. We're going to divide that by the total number of units. And I'm going to use F4 for a hard reference. And then we're going to multiply by the total cost of assembly. And so that gives me $220,000 allocated to the travel model. I'm also going to use a hard reference for G7, so I'm going to push F4. So now I can drag this box over so it'll copy the formula. And so it gives me $165,000 for the sport model and then $55,000 for the pro model. How we allocate the assembly costs. And one nice little thing about Excel is if we highlight these three numbers here, it'll automatically sum it for us. And the sum here is 440,000, which it shows at the bottom. And so we know that we did our formulas correctly. So it's always good to check your work to make sure that you set up Excel correctly. Now we have to deal with our calibration cost. So this one is a little bit tricky because for calibration, the fact pattern tells us that only the pro model goes to the calibration department. So if it's only the pro model that goes there, then that's also the only line that's going to be allocated the calibration costs. So the 44,400 is going to go under pro. And now we can calculate our total product cost. So that'll just be the sum of materials, assembly, and also calibration just for the pro line. Our total cost is $510 for the travel, $1,012,500 for sport, and $561,900 for the pro line. But we have to do one more step. We have to calculate the cost per unit. So for that, we take our total cost, divide that by the number of units, and we can format it into the dollar figure. So that gives us $51 per unit for the travel model, $135 for sport, and $224.76 for the pro model. So we'll just plug in these numbers into MH Connect, and that's our answer. So that's the end of the Chapter 8 homework. If you have any issues with any of the questions that I didn't work out, please feel free to reach out. This chapter can be tricky with the differences between the FIFO method and the weighted average method, but I think if you have your formulas handy, you can always refer to that and know which formulas you need to use for each problem.